Good evening. My name is Anita Chung, Head of Heritage of Daegun. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's program. Daegun Conversations is a forum for sector experts and professionals to share their knowledge, insight, and experience, and also to stimulate dialogue and connectivity with peers and the public. The conservation of Daegun as a center for heritage and arts makes it possible for us to get here together tonight and to engage in this kind of cultural activity. We are grateful to the Hong Kong Jockey Club for this wonderful gift for the benefit of our city. Daegun is honored to have received the Award of Excellence in the UNESCO Asia Pacific Awards for Cultural Heritage Conservation in 2019. We are extremely honored to have the opportunity to invite Professor Richard Engelhardt, founder of the UNESCO Asia Pacific Awards, to inaugurate our Heritage Residency Program in Daegun and to give us a public lecture tonight. Tonight's program is co-organized by Hong Kong U Division of Landscape Architecture, Docomomo Hong Kong, and Daegun. We are grateful to our partners for this collaborative opportunity. May I pass the mic to Cecilia Chiu, who will introduce tonight's program. Yes, sure.
Thanks so much, and good evening, everyone. On behalf of the University of Hong Kong and also Docomomo Hong Kong, I'd like to first thank Daegun for co-hosting tonight's events. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to just say a couple words about the Division of Landscape Architecture's Spring Public Lecture Series, in which this talk is a part of. As implied by the title, Assembling Futures, the focus of the series is on future practices. In particular, the role of heritage conservation and landscape practices in shaping our environmental futures. Now, of course, all built environment professions, practices involve in some way remaking existing environments for future use. But on what basis do different projects envision scenarios of the future? And how have these visions shifted and changed over time? How, for instance, have the unfolding environmental and humanitarian crises around the world today affect the ways we manage, value, design, and imagine the future? How have growing concerns about climate change made us rethink the relationships between nature and culture? And most importantly, what kinds of knowledge do we need to acquire in order to make sure that the alternative futures we enact in our projects are indeed better, more inclusive, and just? Over the past month, lectures in the series have been engaging with these questions, prompting many critical reflections on the notions of sustainability, social betterment, and community building, all of which are essential for heritage and landscape professionals to challenge their own ingrained assumptions about development, about conservation, and about environmental justice. And I certainly hope that we could continue with these important discussions with the remaining lectures of the series, which is coming up one in April 19th, like Günther, but especially the one tonight by Professor Richard Engelhardt. So let me now introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Richard Engelhardt, who has been a prominent leader in cultural heritage research and conservation efforts throughout Asia over the past 4 decades. With degrees in anthropology and history from Yale and Harvard universities, Engelhardt has taught at universities throughout the Asia-Pacific region and served in senior leadership positions with UNESCO and other UN agencies. In 1991, he established the UNESCO office in post-conflict Cambodia and initiated the International Safeguarding Campaign for Angkor. From 1994 to 2008, he served as UNESCO Regional Advisor for Culture in Asia and the Pacific, and from 2008 to 2020 as UNESCO Chargé de Mission and Senior Advisor for Culture and World Heritage Mentor. During the years of service with UNESCO, Engelhardt initiated flagship UNESCO Heritage Awards for Cultural Heritage Conservation in Asia, established the UNESCO ICROM Asian Academy for Heritage Management, and spearheaded the effort to extend impact assessment for cultural heritage sites throughout Asia and the world. After retirement from UNESCO, he remains active in the academia as UNESCO Chair Professor of Heritage Management. Engelhardt is currently visiting professor in the Division of Landscape Architecture at the University of Hong Kong, teaching in the Master of Science in Conservation program and advising the bachelor and master programs in landscape architecture. He also assumes teaching positions at many academic institutions, including Hang Seng University in Hong Kong, the Institute of Tourism Studies in Macao, the School of Architecture and Urban Planning at Southeast University in Nanjing, the International World Heritage Research Institute of Southwest Jiao Tong University in Chengdu, and the College of Architecture and Urban Planning of Tongji University in Shanghai. At the global level, Engelhardt serves as on the advisory boards of the World Crafts Council, the UNESCO Memory of the World Programme, the International Network for Traditional Buildings, Architecture and Urbanism, as well as Docomomo International. At the national level in Thailand, he is advisor to the Siamese Heritage Trust, the Malaysian Heritage Trust, and the Hong Kong Institute of Architectural Conservationists. Over the years, Engelhardt has authored many scholarly publications in the field of cultural heritage. He's also the recipient of numerous awards for public service from the governments of Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Myanmar. In recognition of his contribution to the heritage field, he was honored by the Global Heritage Fund in 2004 with a Lifetime Achievement Award. In 2022, he was appointed to the positions of advisor to the Southeast Asian Ministers of Education Organization, SPAFA Center for Archaeology and Fine Arts. That's a very long resume, but it just tells you that the amazing achievements of Professor Engelhardt. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Engelhardt for his lecture. Tonight, the title is Transformative Heritage Conservation in Hong Kong, Macau, and Mainland China, 25 Years of an Evolving Model. Professor Engelhardt.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much to both Anita and Cecilia for their very flattering introduction. In fact, I couldn't recognize myself in it. But I do recognize in the audience a lot of my friends and former students and current students. So I hope that what I say tonight is going to be a little bit new, or some of it will be a little bit new to all of you in different ways. And if not, well, sit back and enjoy the pictures. And it will be then only a short time until we can all adjourn to a drink and chat. Before I start my lecture, though, I do want to say thank you very, very much to Tycoon and the Jockey Club, of course, to Hong Kong University and the Faculty of Architecture and the Division of Landscape Architecture, to Docomomo Hong Kong, for inviting me and to this prestigious lecture series. I am very, very honored, and I'm very honored to be the first of the Tycoon Heritage, what are we called, Anita? Resident programs, yes. And but I'm certainly will be only the first, and I'll be followed by many, many more, certainly more distinguished people that you will all be able to meet over time. So with that, I will start to talk. I really want to talk about kind of a 25-year perspective on transforming heritage conservation in Hong Kong, Macau, and mainland China. It's partially it's my own personal journey that I'm going to share with you, but a journey that I think many of you have also been on. But also I wanted to fit into the mandate that Cecilia has just given us, and talking about how heritage conservation has been changing in the past generation, in which it has moved from a position of being kind of a peripheral, avocational, extracurricular thing we might do if we had extra time and extra money, but of course, who has extra time and who has extra money? But instead of having it in this peripheral situation, how it moves closer and closer into the center of what is now the sustainable development models that we are all trying so hard to live up to, and which in the post-COVID scenario become even more important and dependent upon us. But in order to talk to you about this transformation, I have to go a little bit into the past. So I hope you don't mind a little bit of journey down memory lane. I want to go all the way back to 1998, when I organized a conference. It was actually took place in Penang, but it was involved heritage conservation people working all over the region, and many people from Hong Kong were at this conference. And it was at a time when everyone was being a little bit nervous. It was the new millennia was coming, and everyone was saying, what's going to happen in the new millennia? How is the world going to change? As if something momentous would happen. But everyone was asking this question. And the question in our minds at this time was, well, exactly what from the past do we really celebrate? And what are we going to take forward into the next millennium to conserve? Obviously, we're not going to be able to take forward everything. We have to make space for new developments, new adaptations, new challenges. But what is it that we are going to take forward because it's what we celebrate and what we want to preserve? Now, I'm going to focus this discussion on with examples from the UNESCO Asia-Pacific Heritage Cultural Conservation Awards Programme. I'm going to do this for particularly to honor Tai Kwun, having won the Award of Excellence in 2019 in this program. But in fact, also to honor Hong Kong, because of all the cities in Asia, the most number of entries and the most number of winners have come from Hong Kong. But also then to say that if we look at the more than 1,000 entries in the program, more than 100 of the winners, or about 100 of the winners, have come from China at large, whether it be mainland China, Hong Kong, or Macau. So we can see that, in fact, if we want to think, we don't necessarily think that the cutting edge of conservation is necessarily in our part of the world, because we live it every day. But the matter of fact, the truth is that the cutting edge of global conservation is right here. It's right here in China. It's right here in mainland China, right here in Macau, and right here particularly in Hong Kong. So I'm going to be using a lot of examples from Hong Kong, and they're going to go through the range of the past 25 years, from early attempts at conserving clan temples and small, modest things in the new territories, all the way through to public housing, to landscape conservation, and then, in fact, culminating in this glorious project here at Tai Kwun. But in order to take you on this journey, I have to go back a little bit forward, a little bit to the beginning. I'm going to take you all the way back to Egypt and to Abu Simbel, and looking quickly at the origins of international cooperation for heritage conservation and why we do it anyway. Then we're going to go a quick trip to Venice. Hope we won't get our feet wet. But there we will look at how international safeguarding campaigns were organized and why we target particular areas. From Venice, we're going to hop to Afghanistan and look at how we can cope with the rapidly changing situations and political and evolving environments for heritage conservation. Finishing our journey at Angkor, which, as you've heard, is very close to my heart, but it's also a place where I think we can really trace this evolving paradigm over 25 years. And then we'll circle back here to Hong Kong, Macau, and mainland China. So quickly to Egypt, we're going to go back to the 1960s and to Abu Simbel, the tremendous temple on the Nile, which was threatened with destruction. Threatened with destruction, why? Because conservation and development were coming into conflict. And it was, I would say, the beginning of the modern conservation movement, because it is a movement that tries to reconcile heritage conservation and development. Development what? Well, the biggest engineering project in the world at that time, up until that time, was taking place on the Nile. They were damming the Nile River. and creating and making the biggest dam and creating one of the biggest lakes, and this was going to drown one of the most important, oldest temple complexes. So what to do? What were we going to do about this? The world got together and decided what they would do is do something very heroic and grand engineering intervention, which is to move the temple from its location, cut it out of the mountain, move it up the mountain, higher up in the mountain, reassemble it on top of the mountain, and therefore save the temple. So it's very interesting that the very largest development engineering project, building the dam, coincided with the very largest ever seen project, engineering project for heritage conservation at the same time in the same place. So the two things meshed together. And this is why Abu Simbel is really the beginning of the modern conservation movement. And in fact, the temples were moved, they were saved, and they are now sit right at the edges of Lake Nasser, and they are accessible to tourism. And so people can continue to visit these temples. But they've also created a new kind of tourism, something that is now, has now taken over quite a lot of interest. And this is whole idea of being interested in conservation itself. So conservation tourism. And this is part of the new phenomenon and something that we see in many of the projects. And in fact, one of the issues that makes Tai Kwun so interesting is in fact the conservation work that has turned this space from a prison into a center for heritage and the arts. Abu Simbel taught us that there are heritage sites all over the world that need to be saved. And why do they need to be saved? Because they all demonstrate some aspect of a common shared heritage of humanity. And therefore, it became clear that safeguarding these sites is a public sector priority. It's something that needs to be invested in as part of a development strategy. And whether you are looking at the strategy from the local perspective, or the regional perspective, or the national perspective, or the international perspective, it still is part of this imperative that development needs to incorporate heritage conservation. But how? But how is the real question. Well, part to answer this, UNESCO embarked in international safeguarding campaigns to mobilize expertise, to mobilize money, to mobilize public opinion, and to behind some of these endeavors. And this is the second phase. And this second phase asks the question, well, we have to focus our attention on what is most endangered, what is the heritage that is most threatened, and that what we are going to lose if we don't take some action. And one of the first international safeguarding campaign took place in Venice, right after the disastrous floods in 1966, and turned Venice into the premier heritage tourism destination of the world, for better or for worse, but we can talk about that later. But very soon after Venice, the attention of the world community actually shifted to Asia, because it was Asia where development was happening fastest, where the population was growing the quickest, where the transformations from rural to urban population centers were moving, and where there were a lot of challenges to integrate heritage conservation into development scenarios, including recoveries from various different kinds of climate-induced disasters or other kinds of disasters. So just as an example of this, after the Pagan 1975 earthquake, another big international safeguarding campaign was mobilized. And we can fast forward to Afghanistan and the bombing of the Bamiyan Buddhas and the international outcry about what do we do in these kinds of situations. We have rapid political change that we really don't have any control over, but which nonetheless heritage becomes a victim of loss. And as I say, then let's then end our global tour at Angkor. Where I had the privilege to initiate the international safeguarding campaign and direct it for many years. And one of the key things about that was the fact that in the 1970s, Angkor was the victim for grand international looting and theft of heritage, which over the decades since has not only been halted, but there's now, if you follow even a little bit of news on Facebook or BBC, you'll know that every week there is a restitution of these stolen properties back to Cambodia and reinstallation, if not in museums, on the sites itself. So this all led to developing a body of international law that safeguards heritage. And this is important because international laws in the UN are made through consensus. And so they're not laws that are developed from any one particular cultural perspective, but they don't get adopted unless there is overwhelmingly a majority consensus around the world. And what we see in these international laws, and there are 6 major ones for heritage, that we see a transformation of the laws and the evolution of them, going from the first one in 1954, the Convention for Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, directly growing out of World War II, to the 1970 Convention, which has to do with stealing and looting heritage, to the 72 World Heritage Convention, which put together culture and nature, to the 2001 Convention, which added underwater cultural heritage, which in fact is the global domain rather than the domain of any one country. Then this then extended into the realm of the intangible cultural heritage, not just buildings and monuments, but all aspects of culture, from dance to music to poetry to literature to anything that you can to call culture, including food and costume, variety of things. And finally, it culminated in 2005 with a very interesting convention which protects the future of culture, the new processes that are developing new kinds of cultural expression, developing new kinds of cultural communities. So we go through a whole transformation since the 1950s to the present time, where we see a transformation of the international effort to conserve culture as part of a larger equation, going from very small concerns of protecting individual sites at the time of war to a very, very large concern that even concerns protecting culture that hasn't even been yet created. So we basically see that there has been an evolution of this conservation paradigm over these 25 years. And this is one of the few slides that I want you to pay attention to and take some note of. That we started off with a very narrow focus. It's kind of a view of cultural heritage. We started off with a very narrow focus on restoration of what were significant monuments. Somehow they were considered significant. Then this view broadened to include the protection of non-monumental vernacular heritage of everybody, not just the heritage of the elite class. And finally, into a vision that we are now operating in, where heritage conservation is in fact an instrument of sustainable development policy and planning. That's the transformation that we're going to see, and we're going to see it in Hong Kong. If we graph this, we could say that in the 50s to the 70s, we were conserving heritage for itself. We are sustaining the heritage resources. We are doing monument conservation because it was a good idea to conserve the heritage for itself. That paradigm was very often seen throughout the world, and here we are at Borobudur in Indonesia, with these grandiose engineering projects where heritage conservation specialists, specialist archaeologists, specialist engineers, specialist architects got together with a lot of international money and did a very kind of very rarefied kind of work on monument conservation. And this is what heritage conservation looked like from the time I was a little kid until I started university. But when I got to university, very soon I was embedded in this next part of the paradigm, which was heritage conservation, suddenly the question was, what are we doing this all for? And the answer was, well, we're doing it for some kind of development. But it was a strange kind of limbo kind of answer that was being given at this period of time, from the 80s to the 2000s, where heritage conservation was seen as a resource, where heritage was seen as a resource for development, yes, but a very limited kind of development within culture itself. This is why we come up with the idea that the only use of heritage is for tourism. Or, well, maybe it's good to conserve some crafts. Or maybe a few dances to entertain the tourists is a good thing. But this is why we conserved heritage for this 20-year period, from the 80s to the 2000s. And many parts of the world were still locked in this paradigm. But since the two, and a very good example was I take from Angkor, from my place, where the site is overwhelmed by tourists who are really not doing anything. Here they're taking a picture of the sunrise. I really do not know why you have to take a picture of the sunrise. Go to Angkor to take a picture of the sunrise. I can see that out my hotel window any day I want. But they overwhelm the site to take pictures of the sunrise. So you really wonder where the disconnect there is. Since the 2000s, and since this conference I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, heritage is now seen more and more as an enabler for broader sustainable development. That includes economic and social and environmental concerns, but across all different kinds of sectors. We ask the question, how can heritage conservation make our public health better? How can it make our education system better? How can we improve our social housing and make housing better? How are these things all somehow anchored in the investments we have done in the past, which we call our heritage, past investments? How do we leverage that investment and take it forward into the future so that we don't just throw it away, but we actually build upon the investment in our assets that we have made in each community, each local community, each national community, and in the international community. And so now we see things, and I use a good example here, as another one of the top award-winning projects that Hong Kong has been able to submit for the UNESCO Awards, and this is at Lai Chi Wo, where we have this comprehensive conservation project of environment, of agronomy, traditional agriculture, of built environment, of intangible cultural heritage, and of new ideas of what is going to be the heritage or the culture of Hong Kong in the future in this area that has now been opened up at the border for inhabitation. In other words, where we can imagine new ways of living. So this whole discourse has led to a question of whose heritage is it that we're actually trying to conserve? And this sounds like a just simply a politically correct kind of question to ask. Of course we want to be, but it's not really just a politically correct question. Because if we think about it, and as is very clearly spelled out in the UNESCO Declaration on Cultural Diversity, that the issue of cultural diversity is the flip side of the issue of biodiversity. We know that we cannot conserve the environment without conserving the biodiversity that's in the environment. And we cannot conserve culture without conserving the diversity that is in culture. And that in fact, that the degree to which we measure our success in either natural conservation or cultural conservation is the degree to which we are able to protect and extend, and that is to say, conserve the diversity, so that we do not lose diversity as we move forward through development, but as a matter of fact, that we sustain the diversity we have and nurture a proliferation of that diversity as we move forward into the future. But we're doing a bad job in Asia, and this is one of the reasons we have the UNESCO Heritage Conservation Awards, to be able to try to figure out how to do a better job. This chart I don't need to look too much at it, but what you can see is that the three big bars are where we're putting all of our effort. which is in religious heritage, monumental heritage, and archaeological heritage of old monuments. And the blue is what we have done in the past, and the red is what we're planning to do in the future. So you can see that our attention is still very, very much in that first part of the paradigm from that we were looking at in 1950. We haven't moved forward in Asia and the Pacific into the new paradigms that we're looking at globally. And in fact, if we look at the sites that are conserved, we see that, yes, indeed, we have conserved lots and lots of nice palaces around the world. And we've conserved lots and lots of nice religious monuments and churches and mosques and temples. And we've conserved lots of monuments built by military commanders and politicians and people who are exercising their might and muscle about how to do heritage. So, you know, when we ask the question, whose heritage is it that we're actually protecting, our answer comes out, well, we're protecting the royal heritage of the princes, we're protecting the religious heritage of the priests, and we're protecting the heritage of the administrators, the mighty politicians, the military people. But, I mean, frankly speaking, I'm not a prince or a priest or a politician, and maybe some of you are, but the real question is, what about everybody who is not? What kinds of heritage are we preserving there? And so this was a question that was part of the sustainable development dialogue that took place on the run-up to the change of the millennium in 2000. And UNESCO developed this global strategy for heritage diversity conservation, which looked at different kinds of underconserved, underappreciated heritage and tried to switch our focus from the kinds of elite heritage to a more general type of heritage that everyone could find some way to participate in, to be a participant in heritage conservation. Whether this involved the very kind of ancient prehistoric heritage in which most of our species has spent most of its time creating rather than just the last 1,000 or 2,000 years. So most of our heritage actually goes back to 200,000, 300,000 years ago. Most of the experience we have with how to deal with the world and the climate change and all the ecological situations are not things that we've only thought about in the last 2,000 years. We've been thinking about them for 200,000 years, and we need to learn from that heritage and protect it. But also about what about the heritage of people who are not usually considered to even have heritage? The refugees, the pilgrims, the slaves, and the immigrants. But in fact, the diversity of our world is made up because people travel around and are immigrants. And what would Hong Kong be if it weren't for people from all over the world being part of that? None of us would be here in this room talking to each other if we were not part of that heritage. The same is true for agriculture. Agriculture is what transformed our world to become what it is today. And the heritage of that transformation is certainly important if we're going to be able to continue to feed the growing populations. That transforms into the heritage of shops and commerce and little shopkeepers. Most of the people around the world, and Hong Kong is certainly no exception, were simply shopkeepers. They were not princes, they were not priests, they were not politicians, they were shopkeepers. And the heritage of those people is ubiquitous and transformed our world. And if you were not a shopkeeper, you were a worker in a factory. If you're not a farmer, you were a shopkeeper. If you're not a shopkeeper, you were a worker. And that's who you were. And that's who you are today still. The heritage of industry, traditional industry and the Industrial Revolution and contemporary industry still is what changes the face of our planet. The industry is what's changing, is what's driving the development of the planet. So what we're talking about is heritage of everyday life. And this becomes the new focus of heritage in this third part of the paradigm that we're talking about, the heritage that is part of the sustainable development equation. So we add to our whose heritage is it anyway, from the princes, priests, and politicians, now we add the heritage of the people to really complete this equation. And this is where the focus of our attention is. And you will see this is the focus where the projects that have been winning the UNESCO Heritage Awards have come from. China has been participating exactly in the same kind of movement. In the year 2000, again, at the new millennia, the China principles were adopted, which set out for the first time the why and wherefore you would do heritage conservation in modern China. In the past, we had the same thing. Princes, priests, and politicians had their heritage well conserved, well funded, and nobody was worried about conserving the Gogong or the Temple of Heaven or the Great Wall of China or the Terracotta Warriors. This wasn't a problem. But since 2000, a completely new kind of heritage has been conserved in China. This is the heritage of villages, village life. Farmers, shopkeepers, workers. And all over China, this heritage has now become the focus of the heritage conservation profession and movements. So we could say that we're involved in a shift in heritage conservation over this past generation, which goes from the monuments of the priests, politicians, and princes to the places and spaces of ordinary people. They go from the abandoned, relict, archaeological sites to living communities. They go from a concentration of conserving just the physical components to now adding on living traditions and practices, the intangible heritage. Which means that before, while we might be able to have done the management of these few buildings by a central administration at the national level, that's no longer possible if we're going to conserve all of the heritage of farmers and workers and shopkeepers and everybody. We have to now decentralize that and make sure that heritage conservation takes place in the community, in every community, everywhere. And this also coincides with the use of heritage and the reason why we do heritage conservation anyway, not just for the pleasure and the plaything of the rich elite, but for the use of the general population as a part of the development equation basically in recognition that investments of the past of whatever kind are the foundation for a good, sustainable development into the future. So we are now focusing very much on heritage conservation, on things that are sustainable, things that are living, that are things that are going to be for the future and going to be useful in the future, not something that is dead and no longer of interest to anyone except perhaps a few collectors of playthings from the past. So heritage conservation now is directly focused in the center of sustainable development. And to understand that, you have to think about what is sustainable development all about. And we talk about it being involved in these 5 Ps: the people and the planet and partnership and peace and prosperity. But let's look at that a little bit in the heritage context. So by here we are at Lai Chi Wo again. By mobilizing traditional land knowledge about territorial, climate, and ecological management, heritage conservation, cultural heritage conservation, actually becomes an act of environmental conservation. The two are not separated. That's planet. If we look at the work that is provided through heritage conservation as a means of improving economic well-being through job creation, and whether this is support for traditional occupations or occupations and new technologies, we are looking at how heritage conservation contributes to prosperity in the community through jobs and livelihood. Partnerships, public-private partnerships, are the way we're going to preserve the heritage over the long period of time, not just for a short little flash in the pan, but something where we take the past, we utilize and adapt it for the present, and we sustain it into the future. And so that we continue to build upon the investments in the past so that heritage is not just a resource for exploitation, but an asset for augmentation as we try to move forward into the development equation. And as a way to reconcile our increasingly fractious urban settlement, urban communities where people are pouring in from very many different ways, do not have a common shared heritage, and need to find this common shared heritage in new ways that they can explore and they can validate and create a new sets of memory. And this is, of course, what we see very well being played out right here in Tai Kwun. And finally, we look at how, in fact, the ultimate beneficiaries of this practice are the members of every community, every population, everywhere. This is an example from the Blue House cluster here in Hong Kong, where when we do heritage conservation, we build back better, and we make something stronger than it was before, more resilient, more well-adapted for the new challenges that we bring forward. So heritage is right now being repositioned to be at the center of the sustainable development equation, right at the middle of economy, which is at the middle of society, which is embedded in the middle of the environmental biosphere. That is, in fact, what was the conclusion of the 2016 UN Global Report, 2016 being the same year that the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted. And so we answer the question, what do we want to conserve, what do we celebrate from the past that we want to bring forward into the future? Well, we're starting to answer that question now. It's the heritage that we've all invested in, and this is what the UNESCO Heritage Conservation Awards tried to identify. The UNESCO Heritage Conservation Awards specifically set out not to look at government projects, but to look at projects in the private sector. Because, of course, government can invest in it has lots of money and can invest in the monuments it wants to invest in. But what about the rest of the heritage that no one is taking care of? This is what becomes the real challenge. And so the objective of the Heritage Awards was to prioritize conservation in the private sector, but not to compromise on the quality of that conservation. So insisting that the best techniques were brought to bear in the conservation of local vernacular heritage as well as the monumental heritage. And that investment in one project should, like any good business investment, should multiply and create new investments in new areas so that we continue to build on that asset. And this is what the Heritage Conservation Awards single out for. And we look for these catalytic investments in unloved, unsung heritage that is going to then knit the community back together and contribute to long-term community resilience and sustainable development in a way that actually impacts future policy planning and urban and rural development decisions. So all the projects that have won the UNESCO Heritage Awards are real-life exemplars of how these principles of sustainable development can be demonstrated through heritage conservation and reinforce one another. I'm not going to go through a lot of details about the heritage conservation criteria. We don't have time for that. But to say that the Heritage Awards are based on very specific professional technical criteria and adjudicated by conservation professionals, a group of conservation professionals, and done through a process of consensus. There are two categories. One is conservation and one is new design and heritage. And sometimes a project like Tai Kwun qualifies under both categories. But the important thing is to think of, when we're talking about these criteria, there are 14 criteria that each project is judged against, but they fall into three groups. The three groups are what's important to understand. The first group is understanding the place. If you don't understand what the place is that you're conserving, no matter how good you do at a technical job, you still are not going to end up with a good project at the beginning. If you take a mosque, and even if you use the best techniques, and you turn it into a discotheque, it's still a bad conservation project, isn't it? Because you have not conserved the essential significance of that mosque. So understanding the place is the fundamental entry point for any conservation project. But once you have that entry point, then you cannot shortchange the technical aspect. And bad technique is never an excuse and never results in good conservation. And that's why every little detail, that's why when you do a conservation project, the devil is in the detail. And you have to actually make sure that every single little point is perfectly taken care of. And if you do something wrong, it's because you've missed one of those points. You've tried to do something generic, when in fact no heritage place, no heritage building, no heritage landscape is generic. It is all very, very specific. So the importance of it is in getting the detail right. But getting one project right doesn't make a lot of impact. So your project has to be a project that is going to continue on. It's going to live on for a long period of time. That's what we mean by heritage. It's going to continue on and on and on. That's what heritage is. But also it's going to catalyze other projects to do the same thing. One heritage conservation in Hong Kong is not enough. 2 heritage conservation buildings in Hong Kong is not enough. One tycoon does not make Hong Kong a heritage mecca. 2 projects does not make it a heritage paradise. We need hundreds of projects in Hong Kong to turn it into the place that we wish to inhabit in the future. So I'm not going to go through all the criteria, but I'm going to show you that, in fact, there are a lot of criteria. And if you don't meet all of these criteria, you don't get a Heritage Award. So congratulations to Tycoon and all the other winners, because you've met all of these criteria. So you see there are 14 of them, a lot of detail here. But I don't need to belabor those. There's also a new design category, also has lots of criteria, but it's still the same kind of criteria. Understanding the place, applying the appropriate techniques, in this case, the new design, and making sure that there is a long-term sustainable impact of these. There's also a cherry on the top of the cake, the cherry being a special recognition for sustainable development. Projects which got all the conservation work, got all the design work right, perfect, 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 but also are exemplars of how heritage conservation is the enabler for sustainable development. Throughout the project for these 25 years, we've had almost 1,000 entries. We've had 278 winners. Most of them have been in the conservation category, but some have been in the new design and sustainable development category. All of the winners are interesting, and one of the interesting things about them is how diverse they are. Heritage conservation is no longer just limited to the big fancy monuments that you would expect heritage to be, but goes from everything from resettlement estates to sunken submarines to village houses. And in fact, as time goes on, we have seen a larger and larger different typology of projects being submitted to the Heritage Conservation Awards. So we get industrial heritage, we get village heritage, we get agricultural heritage, we get single-family housing heritage. But all of the projects that have won a Heritage Conservation Award all demonstrate a combination of technical excellence, traditional knowledge and know-how, and community leadership. They all demonstrate how heritage conservation is, in fact, an act of sustainable development. That's the real point that we are trying to make. And what we mean by that, I don't need to repeat. We mean traditional skills and knowledge. We mean inclusive systems with multi-stakeholders, partnerships. We mean conflict resolution, so it's a win-win situation for everyone who's involved. We mean resilience and long-term and longevity to the conservation work that prolongs the life of our community. And among the winners, we have had 81 winners from China, including Hong Kong and Macau. So the largest number from any country has been from China, and the largest number from any city has been from Hong Kong. And to remind us, we have seen this shift over 25 years that we have seen before in heritage conservation globally. We've seen this happening here as well. In the first 7 years of the Heritage Conservation Awards, there was definitely a focus on elite religious and monumental heritage from the projects in China. It was about restoration of religious heritage. It was about retrofitting of government monuments. It was about urban renewal projects of major commercial streets in the central business district. So it was all very much what you would expect of this first era of conservation. I won't go through all these projects. This is a list of the Hong Kong projects that won during this first phase from 2000 to 2006. You will see there's quite a lot of them, but you will also see its temple, synagogue, temple, cathedral, St. Joseph's Chapel, Tung Hua Coffin House, Andrew's Church. In fact, they're all religious monuments. We saw the same thing in Macau. We had two winners in this period in Macau. One was a religious monument, the other was a bank. Okay, government institution. And we see the same thing in China. We see a large number of many award-winning projects, but again, they were all projects that were, part of the imperial legacy, the palaces and the imperial gardens, religious monuments, clan houses, banks again in Shanghai along the Bund. And in China, we saw something that started to prefigure the next phase, which was the conservation of commercial streets in the central business district, which was, again, this shopkeeper's heritage that was started to being recognized. And that led us into this second phase from 2007 to 2015, where again we have basically the same number of entries and the same number of winners from China, Hong Kong, and Macau. But we see a focus now toward more new design in the area, and I would say a focus on the non-monumental structures that heretofore weren't even considered to be heritage, underappreciated or not recognized as heritage. We see a focus on the use of traditional know-how in the conservation project, not just new building technologies, not just new engineering and architectural technologies, but traditional know-how. We saw participation of the communities in the process, and we see, yes, government buildings, but always in the context of not fixing up the government building to make the government seem important, but repurposing government buildings for community purposes. This was the beginning of the period in Hong Kong where unused government buildings were recycled back for social purposes. And also part of this was looking at how we can prepare for the kinds of shall we say, cataclysmic changes that we could predict were going to be happening to their heritage in the future. What we see in Hong Kong is very interesting. During this period of time, we saw conversion of former military installations into uses into public social service uses. That was the big thing that we saw in Hong Kong during this period, 2007 to 2015. In fact, virtually every one of those projects, except the restoration of the salt pans at Yim Chin Tsai, were all former government facilities that had been recycled into public use. So we can see these pictures here, which show this idea that the former restricted, non-accessible government military installations and other kinds of government buildings become places of public use, public celebration. We saw the same thing in the only project from Macau that won during this period, which was making a public school building for students to come and read. Again, public use. And we see the same thing in China, where now we see a lot of restoration of of villages, especially villages that were being abandoned. We see investment in these villages with traditional techniques, but new construction. We see a lot of this kind of project, and you see. I'll show you the pictures here. And this is the kind of project that was happening in China from 2007 to 2015. A lot of the vernacular local heritage was being celebrated, was being conserved, and that the projects had very heavy community involvement and community celebration in the project process. Now we come into the last part of this trajectory, from 2016, when the Sustainable Development goals were adopted till now, and we have this focus on sustainability. Again, we have seen a similar number of winners, a similar number of projects, but we certainly see a movement of more and more projects being devoted to new design and sustainable development. This focus on sustainability has moved renovation of housing from housing for elite to lower income housing. It has looked at village rehabilitation, not just for making nice villages nicer for tourists, but actually for rehabilitating abandoned villages so they can be reoccupied. It has looked at the repurposing of industrial heritage, which has become obsolete, but the buildings themselves can be recycled for new uses. It has always included ecology and landscape conservation. So not just looking at a single building, but looking at its context and making sure that that is part of the conservation. And the long-term multi-purpose use of the project has been what has been the focus of the winning projects in this past phase of the conservation. So we see this in Hong Kong very much. We see the conversion of the Tai Po police station into an ecology center. We see the renovation of the Blue House cluster to continue to be low-cost housing. We see the conversion of prison into an arts and heritage center. We see the conversion of the mills from an abandoned industrial building into a new hub for design and commerce. We see Lai Chi Wo being an abandoned village that has been now given new life. So this is the phase that we are involved in now. In Macau, we see the same thing. We don't have so many projects from Macau, but we definitely see the same kind of idea. The projects that are now getting awards in Macau are things like garbage collection stations and things that make the urban environment more environmentally friendly. And we see the same thing in China. We see a lot of attention to post-industrial landscapes, villages that have been abandoned and reoccupied. We see dealing with industrial heritage like the railway heritage in China. We see experiments in how to improve rural hygiene in toilet innovation construction. And we see, particularly in the last 2 years, very interesting projects that have been holistic projects for neighborhood rehabilitation in neighborhoods that the government has slated for destruction and redevelopment. And through conservation, they have changed government policy in this. I will only flash these pictures, but we'll go to these last two, who have gotten special prizes in China, the Xiajing in Shenzhen and the Xiaoxihu in Nanjing. Both projects are urban center projects in areas that have been slated to be destroyed and redeveloped with high-rise public housing, both of which are now not only conserved for the housing of the people who are originally living there, but actually required a change in the government's own planning processes to allow this to happen. And these conservation projects achieve that in both this case. So only to say heritage conservation does have impact on policy planning is if you do it right. And I think that is one of the most important lessons we're going to live. There are many lessons to be learned from these 200, almost 300 projects. We've published them all in very beautiful books that have been translated into Chinese and are available free to everyone online. And they are being used to teach. I'm using them to teach in Hong Kong University now. So my students who are studying landscape conservation are studying from these books. And students that I teach throughout China are using these same books. And so we are learning from the best practice in heritage conservation, and which I remind you, so many of the projects come from Hong Kong and are really setting the standard for best practice in heritage conservation, not just here in Hong Kong, not only throughout China, but in fact throughout the whole region. And I would say Asia has now become the hotspot for heritage conservation in the world. We are setting the standard. We're no longer tagging behind Europe in heritage conservation. We are setting new standards because we're keeping the buildings alive and working. We're not turning them into tourist traps. We're not just turning them into yet another museum. We're keeping them alive and working in the community. What better example is there, and what better way to conclude my talk than to remind you that the best way to understand this is to look around you. Here you are in Tai Kwun, the former Central Police Station, now a Center for Heritage and Arts. If you want to understand the impact of heritage conservation on development, you can look around yourself and you thank the Jockey Club for having the confidence to invest in this as a way to sustain the heritage of Hong Kong, not only for its present-day use, but this place is built for the future. And that's the important thing that we want to see. I could go on, and I do have other slides, but I'm going to stop right here and encourage you all as after the lecture, after we have a little bit of Q&A, schmooze around for a drink, just look around yourself and say, this is what we mean. We're now participants as beneficiaries of heritage conservation. And so I would like to just say congratulations to Tai Kwun for setting a wonderful example for us all, but congratulations to all of you who have been involved in so many of these award-winning projects here in Hong Kong that really have changed the paradigm of how heritage conservation has been brought in from the margins and become a center point of policy and planning for the future, not just something that is peripheral or something that we're doing in order to satisfy some kind of voyeuristic curiosity of a few tourists who come around. But we're doing it for ourselves, for our community, for the future of our community. And that's what heritage conservation really is all about, extending what we celebrate, so extending it from the past into the present and making sure it lives on into the future. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Professor Engelhardt, for this very inspiring and also very encouraging lecture. We have invited two discussants who will also respond to the lecture. We have Dr. Linda Shetabi from the lecturer of the Division of Landscape Architecture from Hong Kong U, and also Dr. Ying Zhou, Associate Professor in the Department of Architecture of Hong Kong U. And so they will respond to your lecture, and then they will also moderate some of the questions. And so after that, you can have questions for our speakers. Thank you.
Well, Ying and I both have the privilege of asking you questions tonight and later on at the university.
I should have talked longer then to protect myself from these questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you also, everyone, for being here. I think the conversation is clearly much more important, but I really want to thank you for actually a very expansive, in a way, history of heritage conservation and geographically extremely diverse cases that you've shown us. So I have actually a very, very specific question, especially having sat on the review with you and knowing your expertise, especially in this region. I'm curious, given the breadth of geographies, especially in Asia and Southeast Asia, that you've been encountering, I'm wondering, in terms of the different institutional frameworks that you've been encountering. Of course, in your talk, you were not able to get deep into it. And specifically, of course, I'm thinking about China, because it's quite, in some ways, a unique black swan, you can say, case in terms of especially land ownership. And I wonder how that in particular affects, for example, the operation or the feasibility of sustainable development, especially for older buildings.
Well, of course, that's a very excellent question, and it's a very kind of tough question because, as you say, there's different answers in every different kind of context, and not only just national context, but also you see in China very different kinds of answers being given in different provinces and different regions of China as well. But I would say that, first of all, if we talk about a couple observations. One, if we look at all of the award entries in heritage conservation, one of the things that is very noticeable and that all of the judges have remarked upon is how the entries come from virtually every kind of social, economic, and political administration there is in Asia. So we're not just getting heritage conservation projects coming from, say, Hong Kong and Malaysia and India, former British territories, which have inherited some kind of an ethic of heritage conservation, where we get them from Mongolia, from Kazakhstan, from Papua New Guinea, from Bhutan, from North Korea. We're getting them from every single kind of political jurisdiction. We're also getting them from all different kinds of economic situations, from very, very poor countries in Asia to very wealthy countries in Asia. And we're getting them at different kinds of levels of kind of fancy government buildings or cathedrals or religious monuments to very, very lowly kinds of shops and houses and farms and toilets. I mean, we have had several, conservations of toilets as part of the submissions. And so what we can draw from that is that heritage conservation has this universal cross-cutting concern through all sectors of society. So I think that is kind of the basis, the first part of my answer to your question, is that in fact it isn't the concern of a particular elite group anywhere. And that has been I would say, one of the false assumptions of heritage conservation, continues to be a false assumption in some jurisdictions by government, that heritage conservation is only about rich elite people that are only interested in heritage because it's a plaything of surplus time and surplus money. The Heritage Conservation Awards actually show that that is a false assumption. Now, to answer I could go into various different kinds of these jurisdictions, but to zero in on China. First of all, I think that, although we have this, and it's not an incorrect idea of the kind of hegemony of the top-down political discourse in China. But in fact, the setup of governance in China is not really that way. It really is bottom-up. And there's a lot of decision-making that goes on at the local People's Committee, especially in what to do with fine-tuned land use planning. The government makes broad brush policy. We're going to do this kind of thing for the whole nation. Or at provincial level, they make this broad brush kind of investments of what kinds of institutions are going to be invested in. But when it comes down to the specifics of what we're going to do with this plot of land, it becomes much more of a local decision. And therefore, there's a lot more flexibility than you might assume there is. And within the system in China, there's a lot of scope for public-private partnership, actually, especially if you take private not being individually private, but communally private, groups of people, clan associations, workers associations. We've had some very, very interesting work coming out of this industrial heritage, where the former workers associations are the ones who are the catalysts behind it. The former miners from Fujian, or the former workers in the Jingtezhen pottery factory are the ones who are behind the conservation work of their heritage, of what they have spent their lives working on. And so we get this kind of project coming up. Now, of course, as we judge these projects, we're very conscious of the different kinds of political and economic and social milieu that each project takes place in. And so we don't hold every place to the same kind of particular standards. I mean, heritage conservation has to be very specific to a very specific place, and therefore it has to be very contextualized. So every time you judge a project, it has to be judged in its context, not as a kind of an abstract thing. And so by taking that approach, and by having a large number of judges who are familiar with the projects and can understand the trajectory of these projects, and the very fact that each of the projects is not a short-term project, but it has to be a fully realized project, which take a minimum of 10 years to accomplish. We never get a project that hasn't been in progress for at least 10 years of work. So it has to have some sustained interest, sustained investment, and some expectation of sustainable use to actually even survive into the Heritage Competition Awards. So I think it has been relatively easy to identify. And you can see that we've had from the very beginning a large number of projects from China, which was contrary to many people's expectations when we started this program. We're saying we're never going to get any projects from China because they're all going to be government projects. They're all going to be projects that have been vetted in the past. No one's going to accept any kind of criticism, but in fact, this hasn't been the case at all. And we see, yes, the projects are very often involving a local community and a local university, a local department of architecture or engineering or sociology or anthropology or something that is providing some technical expertise and technical control into the project. And there's often some kind of co-investment from the local government agency, or because they have money to invest in development, and so we see this kind of partnership that evolves, and it's a very, I think, robust partnership of planning and financing on one side, technical control on another side, and shall we say, local community enthusiasm as the catalyst to begin with it.
Any just a very short question, any ones?
You understand that short questions get long answers.
Yes.
So
just one project that you would recommend us look further into, in terms of the use or in terms of the context, because you shared so many that...
Well, I would say that if you're starting off new and looking at these, it's interesting to look at the most recent award winners, because, as I say, the projects have evolved over time. We've become more complex in the criteria and more strict in the judging, but as a matter of fact, as I say that, the very, very first project that won the very first Award of Excellence in the year 2000 was a project in Penang, which also happened to be called the Blue House, no relationship to the Blue House here in Hong Kong. But that still stands out as one of the outstanding projects. And it really pops up on anyone's list anywhere in the world of top 10 heritage conservation projects of the past generation. So I mean, I think that it's interesting to look at the most recent ones, but it's also interesting to look at the developmental trajectory through time.
Thank you so much.
Okay, great, wonderful. Thank you so much. So I am going to open the floor to the public, and we're going to start from the bottom and go our way up. So if we have questions from the front, this middle section, and the end, please raise your hands so we can pass the microphone for the question. Any questions?
Do you think this kind of climate responsive design strategies are important in the procedure of building heritage conservation and also the building design, building and architecture design in our daily work? Okay,
Wonderful.
thank you.
That's a great question. And if we could pass the microphone over to the lady here in the yellow jumper because she's closer by, and then we move to the back.
The reason why I'm asking, because my country happens to be the site of Chernobyl catastrophe, and now presently we have like new experience of war, which is now under discussion. Like, because for example, I'm Ukrainian, right? I think this is very important. It has to be a warning sign, but I don't want to live like in a place which becomes the whole S21. So is there any approach to the balance, some frameworks?
Okay, great, thank you so much. And there was a, yes, there we go.
Do we have a review mechanism to see how this project can sustain for a longer time period after doing the initial like the efforts to mostly of them maybe say a very good planning as the beginning point, but with the time it may change a little bit. So for example, the World Heritage List, they have the kind of trigger point. When something happens really bad, they will have the kind of the risk to denomination. Yeah. But in the conservation awards, what kind of consideration would give to such scenario? Yeah.
Great question. So do you want to?
I don't want too many questions. I can't remember from the beginning to the end.
Okay, so we'll stop right there. So learning from traditional architecture that is from before we had air conditioning, so more climatically sensitive and in some cases passive and perhaps sustainable, to difficult heritage and tourism that deals with difficult and sometimes contested heritage as well, and then a mechanism for reviewing projects that have already won a reward.
Well, these are all terrific questions, and it's going to take me the rest of the time to answer them. But let me answer one thing that pertains to all three questions, is that the Heritage Conservation Awards do not go out and seek projects. They are projects that are submitted by the project proponents, the people who have done the projects, because they believe they are good projects and are putting themselves in competition. And so it's all community identified projects. So we don't go out and look for a project that is going to tell a political story about genocide, or we don't look for an ecological project. So more it is the response from the community to say, what are our achievements? And I think this approach has been, and this is quite different from World Heritage, for example, where you go out and look for particular examples of global typologies and things like that. So it's a completely different kind of approach. And this approach is one to empower the community to do it. It's not to look for good heritage, it's look for good conservation. So we don't care what the heritage is. We care about how it is conserved, how it is interpreted, how it is used and validated. So it really doesn't matter at all whether it's a fancy church or a village toilet. That is absolutely relevant to the Heritage Conservation Awards. It is the process of conservation and the utilization of that end product. So that applies to all of these issues. Now, to the question about ecology, yes, indeed. In fact, if you look at some of the criteria, especially under the technical achievement and both of the sustainability, there are environmental criteria. So every project basically has to conform to environmentally sustainable criteria to be able to make it through the judging process. So there's always this. What is more interesting is the kind of projects we get that are the top winners in the project that do this. And we see, for example, from China, we have seen some very interesting projects that are post-disaster, post-earthquake or post-flooding projects, where the typical response from the government would be to move in with high-tech solutions to replace what has been there for hundreds of years but now has been damaged from an earthquake or from a flood or a landslide, and to replace it with a modern construction. But we see pushback from the communities to do this. They don't want this. They want, yes, they appreciate the financial help and they appreciate the technical strengthening to build back better, but they don't want to build back different. And in fact, one of my very first experiences when I took up my job after Cambodia to be responsible for the entire Asia-Pacific region was just at the time of the first Lijiang earthquake, 1995, I guess it was. And I went there 2 days after the earthquake, and the whole town, every building had been damaged in some way. Everyone was living in plastic sheets in the center of the town. So it was really a refugee camp situation. And there was a great debate at that time in the town about whether or not they should just get rid of all these old buildings made with pounded earth and earthen blocks and things like that, and build new buildings, or whether they should try to rebuild in a traditional way, perhaps with some earthquakes strengthening, but anyway, to build in traditional ways. And it was the town was half and half divided. And I came right into that middle of that conversation. It was a very interesting conversation because it was being moderated by a woman who was the head, who was from the Ministry of Construction. So you would think that she would have been the person who wanted to knock down everything and build up something. But she, in fact, had a background in heritage conservation and anthropology. And she was very interested in not necessarily the technical solution, but she was interested in the sociological solution that would be arrived at in the community. And one of the things that I remember facilitating was a community-based survey of the damage that was done. And what we found in that survey was that the only buildings that completely collapsed were the concrete buildings that had been built from 1970 to 1990. And the only deaths that occurred were in buildings where usually the earthquake happened at about 7 o'clock in the evening, so it was the time when people were preparing dinner. And in many of the traditional houses, the kitchens that had been attached to the sides of the houses had been reinforced with a concrete slab on top. Those concrete slabs all collapsed in the earthquake. And so virtually every person who was killed in that earthquake was a woman who was preparing dinner. And so it became very, very clear that, in fact, a much more resilient response would be to utilize traditional technology, but perhaps not let that be, but to, I would say, when it failed because it was not maintained well, because it was undervalued, because the investments that were made in concrete rather than to concrete replacement rather than to keep the traditional buildings functioning as intended to be. So the response, finally, an overwhelming response from the community was to build back with traditional materials and traditional techniques, and that then resulted in a completely new developmental strategy for the village, which was to pursue World Heritage listing as part of their development strategy, which then turned Lijiang into the second most popular heritage tourism destination in China, for better or for worse, but that was a way of addressing this issue. And we have seen this again, most recently in Taopingqiang. I showed you some slides from there, where there was a tremendously bad earthquake damage in the Sichuan earthquake in 2015, I think it was. And there, again, big towers had collapsed because they were these big earthenware towers. Again, build back, build in tech with traditional technology, with some strengthening of the materials, actually based on the studies of the various stages of these towers, where the early stages were built with much better earthen material. The ones that have been built more recently in the past century were built with much less good quality earth. So the idea was that if you really built with the correct high quality traditional technology, you got a stable structure. Huh? So this kind of thing, we see this again and again and again from these projects in China, where we have a lot of pushback from the community to keep the identity of the community through conservation. And I don't mean to keep it poor, and I don't mean to keep it, undeveloped, because in the Build Back Better, everybody wants running water and electricity and toilets and all of that, yes, indeed, but they don't want to obliterate the memory of the heritage and replace it with some kind of a generic concrete structure.
Well, on that note, on a Build Back Better in a sustainable and yet still keeping local identity and some of our traditional skills alive, I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight and taking us on this fabulous conservation journey. Thank you, Professor Zhu, for your question. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you for joining us, and we will have you for drinks after this. Thank you so much.
We're actually